if we can bring that up, then see if you guys can see that from there. I want you to know where we are in terms of in the book of Kings, because there's so many kings, you guys get completely confused. I get confused studying this, so I don't know you guys, but we are in, so we're going to be studying Judah, which is the southern kingdom, as you see up here, the south, and we are Ahaz, so we're down here. Jotham, we studied him last time, Ahaz, so we'll be talking about him in chapter 16, so it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea how many kings remain, and then we're going to be talking about Hoshea right down here. He's the last king, so this is the end of the king of Israel, and they're taken into captivity, so we're reaching the end of their nation, if you would, and Judah is still a little bit further to go. Now, when we look at the history of Israel, in all the stories of the Old Testament, the question might be asked, so what are we to do with them? Well, Paul answers the question. He tells us in Romans chapter 15, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning. So God has placed the Old Testament there and given us all these stories for our learning. And I don't know about you guys, but our kids, when I put them to bed, almost every single night I'll tell them a Bible story. And very often they'll come from the Old Testament. And so you tell them Bible stories and you apply it to our lives, and it's for our learning. That's what Paul says. So they are written so that we might learn and not repeat the same mistakes that these characters made in the Old and New Testament. The Bible tells us in Romans 15 that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. And so what it teaches us is that when we obey God and put our faith in Him, we will not be put to shame, but rather we will have hope. And so this chapter here in chapter 16 opens with King Ahaz, who's, as I said, in the southern tribes. He was the son of Jotham, who was a good king, and the grandson of Hezekiah, who also was a good king. We might expect, if two generations of good kings, certainly Ahaz would be a good king, right? Because he would have learned from his father and his grandfather. Not the case. And I think it's today. Parents can leave a good legacy behind. It does not guarantee that the kids will follow it. Hopefully they do. When they do leave a good Christian legacy behind, obviously it makes life so much easier for the child. I mean, you look at children who have come in from, different backgrounds, and it can really complicate matters for the child. But it still is up to every single child to make their own decision. And it's never an excuse. You might come from a broken home, and you might say, well, I'm from a broken home, so this is just how I act. No, you're still responsible for your own decisions. And you can make a choice whether you want to be a good kid or a good king, as these kings had to decide, or not. It's still up to everyone individually. And so, unfortunately for Ahaz, even though his dad, his grandfather left a good legacy, he didn't choose that route, and he took a different route. Chapter 16, verse 1. And in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his father David had done. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Indeed, he made his son pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. So rather than following the good examples of his father, grandfather, or even further back, we could say his father David, who would have been, at the beginning of the kings. Well, there was one king before him. But rather than choosing good, he chose to follow Israel's apostasy. And it says here that he sacrificed his own son with the god Molech. And, I've explained it before. Molech, if you remember him, he was the god that held out his hands like this. He was hollow on the inside. They would fill him up with coals, red-hot coals, and then his arms would be filled with coals. He would be fiery hot, and then they would put the babies on his arms, and then they would fry him to death. And as they screamed, they would beat drums to drown out the screams of the child as it would burn to death. So that's Molech. That was how they would sacrifice. Well, he did that to his own sons. Well, Leviticus 20 says, this is what God had to say about Molech. He says, I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from his people, because he has given some of his descendants to Molech, to defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name. God says, you know what? Anybody who's going to sacrifice to Molech, sacrifice his kids to Molech, I'll cut him off. In other words, I'm going to kill him. That's basically what God says. It's a death sentence for that person. And I wonder today, where does abortion come in today? I mean, we might say that's horrible. To sacrifice a child, a little baby, fry him. But, yeah, well, that's the sacrifice to the god of Molech. But how about sacrificing a child under the altar of convenience? It's not convenient for me to have this child, so I'll just get rid of it. Abort it. Where does that come in? I remember our first baby, when we went for a checkup the first time, that I was able to hear the heartbeat of the child. That was very exciting for me that actually was possible. I didn't know that you could hear a heartbeat that early on in pregnancy. Now, if you look at it, I mean, thinking in the fact, is this just some plasma or a bunch of cells, or is this actually a baby? Is it a human being? Well, if you look at it, when the sperm meets the egg, or we could put it this way, when the sperm fuses with the oocyte, it forms a single cell. It's not two cells anymore. It's not, the egg in the sperm. It's one cell called the oocyte. And then that one cell is called the zygote. And that develops, and that's what we call the embryo. And at 8 weeks, it's called a fetus. But by this time, it has a heartbeat. Its legs, its arms, its fingers are beginning to grow. It has its own distinct DNA. It doesn't have the DNA, that's just like incorporated with the mom. No, it's its own distinct DNA. And it has its own brain, its own nervous system, and it responds to stimuli. It's alive. And so its face at 8 weeks begins to develop its features. It's just under an inch long and weighs 1/8 of an ounce. That's how small it is. But it's a complete, we could say, human being. It grows just like a human would grow, producing cells. It turns nutrients into energy through metabolism, just like we do. It has its own, genetic signature. It's not a part of the mom. It's its own distinct signature, its own distinct DNA, and it's a living organism whose all the different parts work together for the good of one whole body, just like us, humans who are born. It has 46 chromosomes, just like we do. And all it needs is just a little bit of time in the right environment and nutrition, and it goes through all the different stages and ultimately will become an adult just like us. So nothing is needed. It's complete. It's whole. It's got a heartbeat. It's got its DNA. It's everything. So why is it different? Aborting a child really that much from sacrificing to Molech. They're both killing a human being as far as I'm concerned. And so I think we should think about that. We might say, well, this is horrible. Well, but how about today? Aren't there many people sacrificing their baby, their sons, on the altar of convenience? I don't have time for this inconvenience in my life, so I'm just going to eliminate it. And so God pronounces judgment on those who sacrifice to Molech. Why not pronounce judgment on those who still do the same thing today, just under a different umbrella? Verse 5. And then Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to make war. And they besieged Ahaz but could not overcome him. At the same time, Rezin, king of Syria, captured Elat for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elat. Then the Edomites went to Elat and dwell there to this day. So the king of the north, Pekah, figured out that if he could stick together, form an alliance with the king of Syria, and defeat Judah, then they would have one last obstacle to fight with the king of Assyria. Because the king of Assyria was a real threat in those days. So he figured it out. You know what? I'm gonna stick with Syria, and we're going to eliminate the south. Well, they invaded Judah, and Judah suffered heavy losses. They had 120,000 people dead, and 200,000 taken captive to the north. But yet, they survived. They could not be fully overcome. And they lost some territory. It says here they lost Elat and so forth. But they survived the attack. Verse 7, it says, So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant, your son. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria, from the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria heeded him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, carried its people captive to Kir, and killed Rezin. So Ahaz now figures, you know what, I got to figure something out, because I've suffered heavy loss, and suppose the guy come back, the north comes back, or king of Assyria comes back, he's going to hire the Assyrians. And before he does that, if we read Isaiah chapter 7, we see that the word of the Lord comes to Isaiah, and he comes to Ahaz, and he says, Ahaz, don't do it. Don't go to king of Assyria. Don't go and hire him. Trust me. Their counsel will not stand. But he has all kinds of excuses. He says, well, I'm not going to try the Lord. I'm going to test him. And the bottom line is he wants to go and he wants to depend on Assyria and not depend on God. And so again, he makes a bad decision. He makes a bad call. And he puts his trust in men rather than in God. And he takes the remaining treasures of the temple, and he takes them to the king of Assyria, and he refers to himself as your servant and your son. You know what, king of Syria, I am now your servant. I am now, I'm going to be subservient to you. In other words, he enslaves himself to the king of Assyria simply because he lacked faith. I think the same thing can happen in our lives today. We can become enslaved simply because we don't want to wait on God's timing. It can be different things. It can be marriage. You don't want to wait. You're in a hurry, so you just grab anyone who comes along. It can be a job. It can be anything else. But waiting for God's timing is so key. It's so important. Trusting the Lord. Isaiah 40 says, even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. So waiting on God, waiting for his timing, trusting the Lord is so important. And for Ahaz, well, he decided he wasn't going to do it. He just was going to trust in his own strength, trust in his own, or rather in the strength of the Assyrians. And it's going to cost him dearly. Verse 10, now King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath. Okay, so it seemed kind of like it worked. The Assyrian king responded to his gifts, and he went up to Damascus, carried the people to Kir, and killed Rezin, the king of Syria. So, in a sense, we could say one threat has been eliminated. So it kind of worked. Verse 10, then the king of Ahaz went to Damascus to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah, the priest, the design of the altar and its pattern, and according to all its workmanship. Then Uriah the priest built an altar according to all that the king of Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz came back from Damascus. And when the king came back from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king approached the altar and made offerings on it. So he burned his burnt offering and his grain offering, and he poured his drink offering, and he sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. So King Ahaz figured, it's okay. I've hired the Assyrians with all these treasures that I've taken from God's house, and he responds and he kills Rezin. So let me go and congratulate him. So he goes to congratulate the Syrian king. And when he's there, he sees the form of worship of this pagan king. And he sees the altar. He sees this modern altar that he really, somehow it attracts, he's attracted to it. And so he brings back this modern form of worship back to Judah. And actually he has the blueprint sent ahead so that when he does arrive, the priest has already rebuilt or built this altar. And God's altar is now replaced, it's thrown out, and they're now using this modern form of worship. I think that can happen today, that the altar is replaced with an updated version, the version of the world. We see something in the world, and it looks so attractive, it looks so good. Today, it can be psychology, it can be the system of the world, greed, packaged into the health and wealth message, or whatever it is that is really of the world, but it is incorporated into the church. And it happens all the time. Tools and techniques and principles of the world now become a system within the church. And that is problematic. And we see that Ahaz does that. He brings that back and he incorporates that into the temple. Verse 17 says, Then King Ahaz cut off the panels of the carts and removed the lavers from them, and he took down the sea from the bronze oxen that were under it and put on a pavement of stones. Also, he removed the Sabbath pavilion which they had built in the temple, and he removed the king's outer entrance from the house of the Lord on account of the king of Assyria. So Ahaz now makes major renovations in the house of God. See, the way it had been constructed was in the way of the new form of worship. It was a hindrance, and thus they had to change it, which ultimately further discouraged the worship of God. And so King Ahaz is an example of a man who puts his trust in himself rather than in God, and his reign really is a complete disaster. If you look in verse 20, it says, So Ahaz rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. Verse 1 of chapter 17, And in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute money. And the king of Assyria uncovered a conspiracy by Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and brought no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done the year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. So remember now, this is the last king before the captivity. Now Hosea, in comparison to some of the other kings, was not that bad of a king. Even though if you look at the history of how he came to power, it was a bloody overthrow of the previous king. But still not that bad in consideration of what some of the other kings had done. So he had to pay tribute to Assyria because they had been conquered by the Syrians. But when Tiglath-Pileser died, king of Assyria, he was succeeded by his son Shalmaneser. And Hoshea thought this is a good time to defect. It's a good time to stop paying tribute and try to befriend the king of Egypt. It says So, king of Egypt. So is probably not the name, but it is a town or a city of Egypt where the king would reside. And he thought, let me try to befriend him, make an alliance here, and maybe I'll be protected by him, and I can overcome and no longer have to pay tribute to the Assyrian king. Well, again, rather than trusting God, he trusts in the king of Egypt. Ahaz trusted in the king of the Assyrians, and now this guy, he trusts in the king of Egypt. Every single time they do it is a disaster. It never works. But they just keep doing the same thing over. I wonder how many times we do the same thing. How many times do I do the same thing? Where it just seems that I do the same thing over expecting different results. But it doesn't work that way. We have to trust in God. When you do that and you trust God for your life, for your future, for whatever it is that your business, that's really the only way that we will succeed and be blessed, really. Verse 5, it says, now the king of Assyria, the plot is uncovered, and Hoshea is thrown into prison, and he's bound because of that. So verse 5, now the king of Assyria went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Halah, by the harbor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So finally, after years of decline, they have come to the end where they have come to where God told them all along they would end up if they would forsake him. God says, if you forsake me, then you'll be taken into a foreign land where you don't want to go. Well, that is the time where they have arrived now. It's been a long, drawn-out decline over the years with a 3-year siege at the end. Then finally, the rebellious house of Israel was completely broken and taken into a land filled with idolatry. It's like God says, you know what? If this is what you want, if you want idolatry and you don't want to trust me, I'll take you to a land. The founder of idolatry, the land of Babylon. I'll take you there, and you'll have your fill. And never again did Israel have a problem with idolatry. They had so much of it, they didn't want to have anything to do with again. I remember I loved wieners. I still do. But one day there was a wiener roast, and I ate wieners, and I don't know how many I ate. And for a long time, I didn't want any wieners anymore. I had too much. I had enough. And so it is with this idolatry. They had enough, no more. And but it's interesting that you think about it. The last king, Hoshea, was not the worst king. In fact, he was a rather okay king. And that is when the nation collapsed and was taken into captivity. You would think it would have been done maybe under King Ahab, one of the worst kings. But no, it happened under a king that wasn't the worst king. It just shows that sometimes judgment builds up. And there is a time when God says it's enough. It doesn't mean that it's kind of like chopping down a tree. You keep swinging the axe. It doesn't mean that the last swing will be the hardest swing. But it's just one of all the swings. And ultimately, the last one cuts and falls the tree. And so it is with the kings. It doesn't mean that the last king is the worst king, but there's been such a long time of rebellion that ultimately God says it's enough, judgment is coming. And so it collapsed and the people were taken into captivity. Verse 13 says, "Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, 'Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servant the prophets.' Nevertheless, they would not hear, but stiffened their necks, like the necks of their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God." God was merciful. He continually sent them warnings. But they were stiff-necked, and they refused to listen. Stiff-necked is the idea of an oxen. They're stiff-necked. It reminds me of cows. Today they're different. When I was a cow, we had Brahma cows. We didn't have Holstein cows. They did have Holstein cows, and they're much better. But we had Brahma cows, and we tried to milk them, and they were it was a disaster trying to get them into the corral, into the chute and all that. Trying to milk them, and they'd be kicking, and they were stiff-necked. They didn't want to go in. That was the nation of Israel. They were stiff-necked and just refused to listen. I think we can be the same thing. And kids, you growing up, youth, be careful not to be stiff-necked when you're being warned by your fathers, or warned by your mother, or warned by someone else. But rather be someone that listens and responds and obeys and trusts in the Lord. Because when you do that, it will go well with you. The nation of Israel continually was stiff-necked, and ultimately they paid a price. And in verse 24, "Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuta and Alba and Hamath, and from Shephavaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they took possessions of Samaria and dwelt in the cities." So here we see the beginning of the Samaritans. The Assyrians mixed with Israel. And they remained until the New Testament times, and we know, Jesus walked through the cities of Samaria, the mixed group of people. Verse 25, "And it was so at the beginning of their dwelling there that they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, 'The nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them. And indeed they are killing them, because they do not know the rituals of the land.' Then the king of Syria commanded, saying, 'Send there one of the priests whom you brought from there, and let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land.' Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. However, every nation continued to make gods of its own, and put them in the shrines and the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities where they had dwelt." Maybe there were so many people killed during the siege. There were bodies that had been thrown all over the place and not properly buried. Maybe there were bones all over. And the lions began to roam in the area, and they began to kill some of the people. And so they're obviously very superstitious, and they think this is a spiritual thing. So they contact the king of Assyria and say, "There's a problem here. The lions are killing people, so there's got to be something wrong. The gods must be angry with us, and so we got to do something about it." And so he sends a priest down who teaches them the way of God. But it's very interesting, because it says here, "But they continue worshiping their gods." They teach them the way of God. He comes and teaches them the way of God, but they continue worshiping their gods. See, they just want enough of God not to be eaten by lions, but yet they want to serve their own interests. How many times is it the same today? People want enough of God not to be eaten by lions. You know, they want to escape the consequences, but yet they want to live their own life, their own interests. You know, how is your life? Are you such a person? You know, I'm going to serve God just enough not to be eaten by a lion, but I'm going to live my own life. I don't want consequences. I don't want to, have the consequences of living in sin. But at the same time, I want to do my own thing, live my own life. I don't really want to surrender my life to God. I kind of have it planned out. It's my life. But on the side, I'm going to serve God and look good. And so I think that you might look to your background, and like King Ahaz, he had 2 generations of really good people in his past, and then further back he had some bad guys, and then further back he had good guys. And I think if you look back in your history, I don't know about you guys, I think most of you probably have good ancestors. You have good fathers, great-grandfathers. They're good people. But maybe you come from a background where there are broken homes, and it is a mess. I think either way, you have to make a choice. Either way, you have to make a choice. Just like this embryo, fetus, is distinct, and it has its own DNA, its own 46 chromosomes. It's its own person. It's not father, it's not mother, it's its own person. Likewise, today, you are your own person. You have to make your own decision, what you're going to be. And I hope that we all make a good decision, that regardless of our past, we don't have to be held hostage by it. We can change, and we can become more like Christ. We can trust him. We can wait for his timing, and we can live a life that is a blessing and is an inspiration to those who are around us. Father, we thank you just once again for what we learn here in 2 Kings, and we just pray, Lord, that you would help us to make good decisions in our life, good choices. We see that we don't have to be held hostage by our past, because we see that there were bad kings who had good fathers, and we see that there were good kings who had bad fathers. So we see that each one is up to themselves. It's our choice. So we pray, help us, Lord, to make good decisions and to trust you at all times. In Jesus' name.